Number 7. The disappearance of Heather Elvis. In 2013, Heather Elvis worked as a hostess at the Tilted Kilt in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, while she was studying cosmetology. In June of that year, the 20-year-old reportedly took notice of a regular customer named Sydney Mora at the restaurant. The two eventually became romantically involved and the affair unfolded. According to Sydney, over most of September, the man's wife, Tammy, soon caught on to her husband's extramarital activities and confronted Elvis on the phone. In the aftermath, the affair came to an end, but Tammy continued to harass her husband's former mistress during the months that followed. The manager at the Tilted Kilt later recounted how the hostess was genuinely scared of Tammy, who would allegedly call her for hours and hours at a time in order to taunt her. By December, the harassment had reportedly begun to die down, but then, on the 17th of the month, Elvis went missing. Investigators established that she'd last been heard from at around 1:45 a.m. the following morning. Elvis had called her roommate to say that Sydney had requested to meet up with her. The exact circumstances of Elvis's disappearance have been widely debated in the years following the incident. While the Moras were both initially charged with the young woman's murder, those charges were later dropped without prejudice by prosecutors in March of 2016. On charges of obstruction of justice, Mora's trial ended in a hung jury, while Tammy was ultimately convicted in October of 2018. As of the latest updates on the case, Elvis's whereabouts remained unknown. Number 6. Nicholas Dracula. At around 4:30 p.m. on January the 31st of 2021, police officers in Niles, Ohio, were dispatched to the Morrow Circle apartments in response to multiple 911 calls about shots fired on the premises. Once at the scene, the officers were directed to a male resident who sustained a gunshot wound to his right leg. The victim had been shot while he was watching television in his apartment. After speaking with several witnesses at the scene, investigators concluded that he hadn't been the intended target of the gunman, who was identified as Nicholas Dracula, aged 21. According to the police, Dracula had driven to the apartment complex from his home in Middlefield in order to confront the man whom he suspected of having an affair with his girlfriend. He reportedly shot in the direction of his alleged love rival, but the bullet instead entered into the adjacent apartment and hit the non-involved neighbor in the leg. Following the shooting, Dracula had returned to Middlefield, where he was tracked down by law enforcement and taken into custody. He was charged with 2 counts of felonious assault, to which he pleaded guilty in July of 2021. Dracula was ultimately sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Number 5. Simona Paulson and Jason Mays. Jason Mays called 911 on the evening of August the 13th of 2015 to report that he'd fatally shot his girlfriend's husband at his North Phoenix residence. In his conversations with the emergency dispatcher and the police officers that were subsequently sent to investigate, Mays reportedly attempted to describe the shooting as an act of self-defense. He claimed that the victim, William Paulson, had initiated the deadly altercation by approaching him with a knife. According to the gunman's testimony, Paulson's attack had been prompted by the discovery of a long-standing extramarital affair that his wife, Simona, had been having with Mays. Although the authorities initially accepted this version of the events, the victim's relatives maintained that it simply wasn't in his nature to be confrontational and violent to the degree that he'd been accused of being on the night of the incident. The family thus decided to hire a private investigator to examine the situation more closely. They also reportedly convinced the police to analyze the knife that Paulson was said to have wielded on the evening of his death. A more thorough investigation of the evidence recovered from the crime scene determined that the victim's DNA could not be found on the knife with which he'd purportedly attacked Mays. Furthermore, the fingerprints taken from the firearm belonged to Simona and not Mays, as it was initially believed. Following these dramatic revelations, law enforcement's focus shifted to Simona, who'd allegedly gunned down her husband so that she and Mays could continue their relationship unabated. She was subsequently charged with second-degree murder, while Mays was charged with tampering with evidence. Number 4. The shooting of Kendra Hatcher. In the late summer months of 2015, dentist Kendra Hatcher returned to her home in Dallas, Texas, after she and her boyfriend had gone on a trip to San Francisco, where they looked for an apartment together. On September the 2nd, Hatcher was fatally shot in the parking garage of her upscale apartment building. investigators turned their attention towards Brenda Delgado, the jilted former partner of the victim's boyfriend. The police had reportedly been tipped off about the 33-year-old woman's suspected involvement in Hatcher's murder and learned that Delgado had grown increasingly unhappy with her ex-boyfriend's new relationship. In the months preceding the deadly incident, Delgado allegedly solicited the services of Crystal Cortez and Christopher Love, whom she paid in cash and drugs, to carry out Hatcher's killing. Love was alleged to have acted as the gunman, while Cortez reportedly served as the getaway driver. In the end, both were convicted of capital murder, although Cortez managed to secure a reduced sentence by testifying against the others involved in the plot. Delgado had fled to Mexico, but the authorities ultimately tracked her down and she was extradited back to the United States. In June of 2019, she was sentenced to life in prison for her role in Hatcher's killing. Number 3. AnneMarie Anastasia. On October the 5th of 2015, law enforcement in Lothian, Maryland, was called to the home of Anthony and AnneMarie Anastasia. Following their arrival, the officers made their way down into the basement, whereupon they discovered a man and a woman who'd succumbed to fatal injuries. The male victim, 40-year-old homeowner Anthony Anastasia, had been fatally shot in the head. The female, who was subsequently identified as 25-year-old Jacqueline Riggs, had been brutally attacked and stabbed a total of 42 times. The deceased man's wife, AnneMarie, initially told the police that her husband had taken his own life. However, the handgun that was found next to Anthony's body did not match a bullet shell casing that was discovered at the scene, leading investigators to conclude that the fatal gunshot had been fired from a second weapon that was subsequently removed from the basement. After a police investigation was set into motion, it was discovered that AnneMarie had taken part in a number of suspicious text exchanges with two teenagers, one of whom was later named as Gabriel Struss. The damning messages centered primarily on the 43-year-old woman's attempts to acquire a firearm, which she allegedly sought to use to kill her husband and Riggs, who was his live-in mistress. AnneMarie pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, and both she and Struss were ultimately sentenced to 60 years in prison. Today's topic was requested by Brett O'Neill, Mr. Faceless, Cheeks 7566E, and Gabriella Silva. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Sabrina Lyman and Jonathan Hearn. On August the 17th of 2014, California man Robert Lyman was gunned down at his place of work in the Kern County city of Tehachapi. Investigators would later identify the perpetrator as 28-year-old Jonathan Hearn, a former Redlands firefighter. In the months leading up to the murder, Hearn had reportedly been involved in a romantic affair with the victim's wife, Sabrina. Prosecutors asserted that Hearn had conspired with his mistress in a plot to eliminate her husband. It was an allegation that the woman vehemently denied during her interviews with the police, as well as over the course of her subsequent criminal trial. Sabrina's claims of innocence were roundly disproven, following the discovery of burner phones which she had used to communicate with Hearn on a number of occasions. Court records indicated that the content of their secret messages centered on a collaborative effort to kill Robert and put an end to their love triangle once and for all. During the conversations that Sabrina and Hearn had carried out in secrecy, they made multiple references to the biblical story of David. As was captured on a recorded phone call between the two lovers, Hearn used the story of King David's affair with the woman Bathsheba and his subsequent decision to kill her husband as justification for his and Sabrina's murderous scheme. It also emerged that the pair had initially plotted to poison Robert with arsenic-laced pudding, a plan they ultimately abandoned for fear of getting caught. In the end, Sabrina was given a life sentence following a first-degree murder conviction, while Hearn was sentenced to 25 years and 4 months in prison. Number 1. Thomas Montgomery. In May of 2005, a New York man named Thomas Montgomery began instant messaging an individual with the online name Tall Hot Blonde, whom he'd met in a gaming chat room. A married father of 2 in his mid-40s, Montgomery reportedly gave himself the online moniker Marine Sniper and told the person he knew as Tall Hot Blonde that he was an 18-year-old Marine whose deployment to Iraq was imminent. Not long after their initial correspondence, the exchanges between Montgomery and his new acquaintance, who revealed to him that she was an 18-year-old named Jessie, became romantic in nature. The pair engaged in an online affair and allegedly exchanged photographs with one another, some of which were described as explicit. It was reported that Montgomery had sent his love interest pictures of himself as a teenager to maintain the illusion that he was still a young man. Montgomery's wife Cindy eventually caught on to her husband's online relationship and sought to put an end to it by sending Jessie an up-to-date photograph of the middle-aged man who'd been posing as a teenager. Consequently, Jessie promptly ended her involvement with Montgomery. In an act of retaliation against her former online boyfriend, Jessie reportedly used the internet to track down and flirt with a 22-year-old co-worker of his named Brian Barrett. The blossoming romance caused Montgomery to be overwhelmed by jealousy and rage. On September the 15th of 2006, he fatally shot Barrett at their mutual workplace. Local police swiftly tracked down Montgomery and took him into custody. During the ensuing investigation, the sordid internet love triangle was unearthed, and law enforcement learned that Jessie was a 45-year-old woman named Mary Sheila. She'd used pictures that were actually of her teenage daughter to flirt with both Montgomery and Barrett. The former was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison for the murder, while New York prosecutors desperately attempted to charge Sheila for her deceptions. They couldn't find any laws that she'd definitively broken, and she was thus allowed to walk free. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be stuck in a love triangle or have to choose your favorite child on national TV? Let us know in the comments section below.